She was 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. 3 days earlier, her uncle had balanced his household accounts and found her a line item he could no longer afford. In the pocket of her coat, wrapped in a handkerchief that still smelled faintly of machine oil, sat a brass compass that had once belonged to her father, the only true north she had left in the world. And with the last of what remained to her name, she had just done something no sensible person would ever do, paid $73 for a landlocked steamboat, rotting in the middle of the Nevada desert, 100 miles from the nearest paved road. What nobody knew, not the county clerk who sold it to her with a shrug, not the sun-bleached town that watched a lone young woman walk its single dusty street with one battered suitcase. Not even Clara herself, not yet, was that somewhere inside that ship's ruined hull sat a secret that would change the rest of her life. So settle in tonight, wherever you're watching from, because this is the story of Clara Bishop, and the ship the locals called Bell's Folly. Clara had been raised, in effect, by two entirely different philosophies of the world, though she wouldn't have used a word so grand at the time. Her father, Elias Bishop, was a machinist in the Kansas City rail yards, a big, unhurried man whose hands always smelled of grease and whetstone oil, whose voice had the low, patient cadence of someone who never once needed to raise it to be heard. He kept a workbench in the shed behind their small clapboard house, cluttered with calipers and half-stripped valves and coffee tins full of mismatched screws. And on Sunday afternoons he would sit Clara on an overturned crate and teach her to read a blueprint the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, patiently, reverently. One line at a time, his thick finger tracing a tolerance measurement until she could see the shape of the finished part in her mind before it ever left the drawing. "A machine never lies to you, Clara," he told her once, turning a disassembled governor valve over in his palm so the lamplight caught the worn brass. "It only ever tells you the truth about what you've put into it. People will tell you all sorts of things. A good machine never will." He died when she was 12, on a gray Tuesday morning in March. When a boiler he had inspected only the week before let go on a locomotive 2 men down the line, no fault of his own, the inquest found, only bad iron and worse luck, a fact that comforted no one. Least of all a 12-year-old girl standing at the edge of a rail yard crowd. He left her almost nothing except his tools, a wall of hand-drawn schematics rolled and tied with butcher's string, and the compass, which he had carried since his own youth as a river pilot's apprentice before the rail yards ever claimed him, on its brass case, worn nearly smooth by 4 decades of thumbs. Were words he had scratched there himself with the tip of an awl, "Know where you stand." Her mother, Margaret, she remembered less as a person than as a sensation, the smell of lavender soap drifting from a wash basin, a humming voice threading through the kitchen on a summer evening. A cool, dry hand pressed briefly to a fevered forehead. Margaret had died of pneumonia when Clara was 7, quietly, over the course of one hard winter, and by the time Clara was old enough to properly grieve her, the grief had already softened at the edges into something closer to a fragrance than a memory, something she could only ever half catch. Like a scent carried on wind from a room she could no longer find. When Elias died 5 years later, it was Margaret's older brother, Walton Cobb, who took Clara in, not out of warmth, for there was precious little of that in him, but out of the plain, immovable sense of obligation that governs a man who keeps his family the way he keeps his books, in tidy columns that must, above all things, always balance. Walton ran a modest bookkeeping and insurance office on the 2nd floor of a brick building in downtown Kansas City, and he regarded his niece, from the very first week she slept beneath his roof, as an entry on a ledger, a fixed cost, a line item to be managed and eventually closed, never once a person to be loved for her own sake. Clara worked in his office by day, filing correspondence and learning to keep accounts with the same quiet diligence her father had once brought to a lathe, and at night, in the narrow room above the stairs, by the light of a single candle she was careful to trim so as not to waste the wick. She unrolled her father's schematics and kept his trade alive in her hands, 1 gear ratio, 1 tolerance measurement at a time. She became, without anyone quite noticing, fluent in 2 entirely different languages at once, the cold, careful ledger book of profit and loss that ruled her uncle's every waking hour, And the elegant, forgiving logic of a machine that had once ruled her fathers, and she never let either one of them know just how fluently she spoke the other. The end, when it came 8 years later, arrived the way most cold things do, dressed up neatly as good sense. Walton's son Harold was to be married that October to the only daughter of a man named Preston Value, whose modest insurance agency Walton had spent nearly 2 years courting into a formal merger of firms, and in Walton's careful mind, the wedding and the merger had become, for all practical purposes, a single transaction requiring a single guest room, a single set of consolidated finances, and no complicating variables left unaccounted for. He called Clara into his study on a Thursday evening after supper, did not ask her to sit, and did not once lift his eyes from the ledger open flat on the desk before him while he spoke. "The room will be needed for Harold and his wife," he said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading a balance forward from one page to the next. "You're 20 now, Clara. Old enough to make your own arrangements. I've thought it through carefully, and I believe $85 is a generous settlement, given what your keep has cost this household these past 8 years. He said it the way he might have announced the closing of a minor account, and in a sense, Clara understood. That was exactly what he had done. "You've been no trouble, Clara," he added, almost as an afterthought, still without looking up, as though the sentiment were a footnote rather than the point. "I want that understood. This isn't a punishment. It's simply arithmetic." She did not plead. She did not cry, or ask him to reconsider, or remind him of a single one of the 8 Christmases she had spent under his roof. She had learned long ago that appealing to a ledger only ever invited a recount, never a change of heart. "Thank you, Uncle Walton," she said simply, folding her hands in her lap. "I'll be out by morning." That night she packed what belonged to her, truly belonged to her, into a single battered suitcase, her father's compass, wrapped carefully in its handkerchief. His small leather roll of hand tools, worn soft and smooth at every clasp, 2 plain cotton dresses and a darned wool coat, her mother's tortoiseshell hair comb, and the folded schematics she had kept for 8 years the way other people keep scripture. On her way out the front door the following morning, suitcase in hand, she paused at the hall table, where a new photograph had recently been set into a polished silver frame, Harold and his bride-to-be, flanked by Walton and his wife. All 4 of them smiling for a portrait taken only the week before, a portrait in which, she noticed without any real surprise, there had never once been room for her. She closed the front door behind her softly, so as not to wake the house, and felt the compass shift against her ribs through the coat pocket as she stepped down onto the sidewalk, a small, solid weight that told her, at least, exactly where she stood, even if nothing else in the world could. The bus west took 2.5 days, and Clara spent most of it with her forehead resting against the window glass, watching Kansas fold slowly into Colorado and Colorado fold, in turn, into a flat, merciless country she had no name for yet. The fine desert dust came in through the seams around the windows no matter how tightly they were latched, settling like flour on her collar and in the creases of her knuckles. The afternoon heat pressed down through the roof of the bus like a heavy hand laid flat between her shoulder blades. Strangers dozed against her shoulder in shifts, smelling of sweat and stale tobacco and the particular exhaustion of people traveling towards something only because they had nothing left worth traveling away from. Clara found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid. She had already lost everything a person could reasonably be asked to lose, and there was a strange, clean freedom in that fact. A private maxim had begun forming itself somewhere over the Colorado line, one she would return to for the rest of her life. One cannot truly lose what one never possessed, and love, real love, was never a thing that could be repossessed. At a rest stop outside Ely, Nevada, thumbing idly through a week-old newspaper someone had left folded on a bench, she found what she had been looking for without ever knowing she'd been looking for it at all, a county legal notice, printed in cramped 6-point type between a livestock auction and a church supper announcement, listing a public sale of delinquent tax properties in a place called Deadwater, Nevada. The name caught in her chest like a hook set deep and would not let go. Deadwater had once had a river, the Amargo, according to the leathery, sun-cured feed store owner who gave her a ride the last 11 miles in the bed of his rattling truck, until an upstream dam had strangled it dry back in 1908, and after the river went. The silver mine that had built the town went with it, and after the mine went, most of the town went too, until what remained was a single dusty street of perhaps 40 stubborn souls. A general store with faded lettering, a shuttered assay office, and a heat that shimmered up off the cracked, empty riverbed like something almost alive. But it was not the empty street or the boarded storefronts that stopped Clara cold in her tracks, it was the thing sitting square in the middle of the old riverbed itself. Canted slightly on its side in a wide bowl of dried white clay, dwarfing every structure around it for half a mile, a 140-foot paddle-wheel steamboat, 3 decks tall. Its twin stack still standing black against the sky, its paint scoured long ago to bare gray wood by 4 decades of wind, absurd and magnificent and utterly abandoned. A ship built for a river that no longer existed, with nowhere left in the world to sail. She stood in the middle of the empty road and looked at it for a long, long while, feeling something in her chest tighten and loosen all at once, because she recognized it immediately. The way you sometimes recognize your own reflection in a dark window at night, a forgotten ledger entry, built for a purpose the world had quietly and efficiently erased, still standing anyway. Out of nothing but stubbornness. Just like her. She found the county assessor in a single cramped room behind the feed store, a dry, unhurried man named Everett Kinsey who looked up over his spectacles when the bell over the door jangled and made no particular effort to hide his disbelief at the sight of her, a lone young woman. Dust to her ankles, one suitcase, standing in his doorway like she'd walked out of the desert itself. "You're here about the folly," he said, and it wasn't really a question, nobody ever came to Deadwater for any other reason. He explained, without much prompting, that a man named Silas Bell had built her back in 1897, so certain the river and the silver would run forever that he'd sunk his entire fortune into her keel. And that she'd made exactly one full paying season of runs before the water started dropping and simply never stopped. Locals started calling her the Folly before she'd even finished her first winter, Kinsey said, not unkindly. Man never did live it down. Back taxes on her and the quarter-acre she's sitting in come to $73 even, he added, sliding a heavy county ledger across the counter toward her. And when Clara opened her purse and counted out the sum in worn, soft bills and a small handful of coins, very nearly the last of Walton Cobb's $85. Less what her bus fare had cost her, Kinsey only raised his eyebrows a fraction of an inch and murmured, "Well, God help you," then, in the dry, resigned tone of a man who had watched fools and dreamers pass through his office his whole career and had long ago stopped trying to tell the two apart. "You know she doesn't run," Kinsey said, not unkindly, watching her count out the coins one by one. "Boiler's cold 40 years. No river to put her on even if it did fire." "I know," Clara said. "I don't intend to sail her anywhere." Kinsey studied her a moment longer, the way a man studies a hand of cards he can't quite make sense of, then shrugged and reached for his pen. He filled out the deed by hand in a careful, looping script, sanding the wet ink with a little brass shaker so it wouldn't smear. Sealing the transfer with a blob of red wax pressed by a stamp so old its edges had gone soft and rounded. And slid the brittle paper across the scarred counter to her like he was handing over the punch line to a joke nobody else in town particularly wanted to be part of. The true scale of the thing did not become real to Clara until she was standing inside it, alone, with the door swinging shut behind her on a groan of rusted hinges. Dust lay over every surface thick as a blanket, soft and pale gray and entirely undisturbed, rising in slow, lazy clouds around her boots as she moved from room to room in the gloom, a long dining saloon with its heavy tables still bolted fast to the floor, a row of staterooms no larger than closets. Their little brass fittings gone green with age, a pilot house with a great wooden wheel taller than she stood, its spokes worn glass smooth by hands 40 years gone and long since buried. She climbed the narrow stairs to the Texas deck and found the captain's family quarters there, empty picture hooks still driven into the walls where portraits must once have hung, and higher still. The wheelhouse itself, glass long gone from 3 of its 4 windows, wind moving freely through it now the way it must once have moved only through the open river air. She counted her steps as she went, the way her father had once taught her to pace off an unfamiliar building, 140 feet stem to stern, 3 decks stacked one above the other. A weight of neglect so total that even the silence aboard her seemed to have its own particular density, its own grain, like the dust itself. She climbed down at last into the very belly of the ship, into the engine room, where 2 great iron boilers sat cold and silent beneath a tangle of pipe and valve and cracked leather belting. And she crouched there for a long while with a rag and a borrowed lantern, tracing each linkage the way her father had once taught her to trace a schematic, testing a valve here, a fitting there. Working the rust from a governor by feel alone, until she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a held breath finally let go, that whatever else had failed this ship, the river, the town, the fortunes of a man named Silas Bell, the engine itself, underneath 4 decades of neglect, was fundamentally sound. It was a home waiting to be awakened, nothing more and nothing less, and for the first time since she had stood at the edge of a Kansas City rail yard 8 years before. Clara Bishop felt something rise in her chest that was not quite hope, but stood very close beside it. She chose the old captain's day cabin as her first habitable corner, simply because it was the one room whose door still closed all the way. And she measured the weeks that followed not in days but in small, methodical victories, each one logged in a cheap notebook the way her father had once logged his own repairs. On the first day she swept 11 years of dust out through a gap in the deck planking, filling 4 buckets before the boards showed their true color again. On the 4th day she patched a broken windowpane in the galley with a scrap of tin and a smear of pitch, and slept better that night for the draft being gone. By the 9th day she had coaxed the old cistern pump back into groaning service, and water, always water, out here, more precious by far than the money in her pocket, became the one resource she rationed like a miser rationing gold, a single bucket a day for washing, cooking, and drinking combined. Measured out each morning by eye. She spent the 11th day chasing a family of pack rats out of the linen closet with a broom and no small amount of language her uncle would not have approved of. And the 14th patching a hole in the promenade deck roof with tar paper weighted down by stones, working until the light failed and her fingers were black to the second knuckle. By the 18th day she had rigged a length of mosquito netting across her cabin's broken window, tired of waking with her arms stippled in bites. And on the 22nd she walked the full 2 miles into town under a punishing noon sun simply to trade a morning's labor mending Everett Kinsey's fence for a sack of flour and a tin of lard. Coming back sunburned and satisfied in equal measure. On the evening of the 16th day, she finally got the old galley stove drawing properly, feeding its splintered deck rail and dry brush scavenged from the riverbed. And when the first hot meal she'd cooked aboard the Folly, plain beans and a wedge of cornbread, nothing more, was finally ready. She sat on the overturned crate that served as her only chair and ate it slowly, savoring the warmth of it spreading through her, a small, hard-won pocket of civilization inside 140 feet of rust and silence and dust. It was in her 3rd week aboard that she found the one door she couldn't open, a narrow, iron-strapped door set below the pilot house. Into the wall of what must once have been the captain's private cabin, locked fast with no visible keyhole for a key she didn't have and had no way to find. She tried her father's old lock-picking tricks first, the ones he'd taught her half as a game on rainy Sunday afternoons, working a bent length of wire patiently through the mechanism by feel. Coaxing and listening for the small, telling clicks he'd taught her to feel for as much as hear, but whatever lock lay behind that iron plate had rusted solid decades before she was ever born. And after nearly an hour of careful, fruitless work, she finally admitted defeat and turned her attention instead to the door's 3 heavy hinges, thick with corrosion. And decided to go around the problem instead of through it, exactly as her father had always told her to do when a machine refused to yield to its intended method. It took her 2 full days of steady, stubborn work. She worked the hinge screws loose 1/4 turn at a time with a hand drill and a dab of kerosene to soften decades of rust. Her knuckles scraped raw and bleeding against the corroded iron strapping, her shoulders aching from the cramped angle required to reach the lowest hinge. breaking twice to soak her hands in the last of that day's water ration before forcing herself back to the work. On the afternoon of the second day, the last stubborn screw finally gave way beneath her palm, and the door shuddered free of its frame all at once and swung inward on its own weight with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere far older than the wood itself. The air that rolled out to meet her was stale and cool and utterly, perfectly still, carrying the strange, preserved smell of a room where time itself seemed to have simply stopped one afternoon and never resumed. A roll-top desk sat against the far wall, its surface undisturbed beneath a soft gray shroud of dust. A captain's coat still hung on a brass hook beside the door, moth-eaten and faded gray with age. Nautical charts curled yellow and brittle on the walls, a single cracked shaving mirror hung crooked above a washstand, and squarely in the center of the desk blotter, exactly where its owner had last set it down, sat a thick, leather-bound logbook, closed, waiting, as though its writer had only just stepped out for a moment and fully intended to return. The logbook belonged to a man named Josiah Hale, and its dated entries, written in a small, careful, increasingly weary hand, traced 11 long years of a decline Clara recognized in her bones long before she understood the full shape of it. April, 1908, read the first entry she opened to, the ink faded to rust brown. River down 8 inches this week. Bell says it will rise again come spring. I am not so certain. The entries grew sparser and starker as the pages turned and the years wore on. 1911, mine closed for good today. 40 families gone or going by month's end. Sold the good lamps for coal money. 1915, sold the last of the brass fittings to a scrap man out of Ely, for food and little else. 1919, I do not believe the river is coming back. Nor, I think, is anyone else who left, until the final entry simply stopped, mid-page, mid-thought. As if the hand that wrote it had set down the pen one evening and never once picked it back up again. Clara sat with the logbook open in her lap a long while, listening to the wind work at the old timbers overhead, before she noticed, running her fingers absently along the desk's bottom drawer front, that the grain of one small panel didn't quite match the boards around it, too straight, too new, beneath its coat of dust. She tapped it once with a knuckle and it gave back a faint hollow note where the surrounding wood answered solid and dead. She pressed carefully along its edge until her thumbnail caught a hairline seam, and with slow, steady pressure the false panel sprang loose all at once to reveal a shallow compartment hidden behind it, a thick fold of bills bound with a length of twine, a small object wrapped in oiled cloth, and a letter, sealed with wax, addressed in the same careful hand to whomever finds this. The bills, counted twice with shaking hands, came to $340, more money than Clara had ever held at one time in her whole life, and the oiled cloth, unwrapped with careful fingers by lamplight, revealed a small gold locket holding 2 faded photographs behind cracked glass, a young woman with a soft, serious face, and a little girl no older than 5, her hair done up in ribbons for whatever occasion had called for a photograph at all. The letter, when Clara finally broke the wax seal and unfolded it, explained everything the logbook had only ever hinted at. Josiah Hale had been the Folly's second captain, and in the autumn of 1907, while he was 3 days upriver on what should have been a routine run to Reno and back, influenza had swept through Deadwater without warning and taken both his wife Sarah and his daughter Ruth within the same terrible week, before word could even reach him and turn the boat around. He had never truly left the ship again after that, he wrote, not out of madness, though he supposed it might have looked that way to the town, but because it was the last place he had ever been genuinely happy, and he could not bring himself to abandon the one thing in the world that still, faintly, smelled of the life he had lost. He had taken whatever work the dying town could still offer a man for 11 long years, and rather than spend what little he managed to save, he had hoarded it, dollar by careful dollar, telling himself he was saving towards some eventual restoration he never, in the end, had the strength to begin alone. He wrote of the sound Sarah used to make humming over the galley stove, and of teaching small Ruth to name the stars from the Texas deck on clear nights before the river ever began its long retreat. And of how, in the 11 years since, he had come to find those two absences louder aboard the Folly than any silence in an empty house in town could ever have been, and how that, strange as it might sound to whoever finally read these words, had felt like the only honest place left for him to grieve. I leave this, the letter closed, the handwriting noticeably weaker in its final lines, not to the county, and not to any bank, but to whomever has the patience and the vision to find value in what everyone else has long since abandoned. I hope, whoever you are, that you love her better than I was able to, at the end. I hope you let her carry you somewhere I never could. Clara sat for a long time afterward with the compass in one hand and the locket in the other, one a guide her own father had left her toward a life still ahead. The other a reminder Josiah Hale had left behind of a life he could never return to, and by the time the light through the porthole had gone from gold to gray to nearly nothing. She had made up her mind entirely, she would not simply spend Josiah Hale's money. She would stay. She would build something worthy of both the gift and the 11 lonely years it had cost him to save it. The plan that took shape over the following weeks was, at its core, a simple one. A new state highway was already being surveyed 12 miles east of Deadwater, and where a highway went, travelers were sure to follow, prospectors, traveling salesmen, families chasing work further west, all of them needing exactly two things a dying river town could no longer easily provide: a clean bed for the night, and someone competent who could fix whatever had broken on the road. Clara meant to give them both, lodging above and a working repair depot below, in the very same hull that had once carried silver or downriver and now carried nothing at all. She took the assessor's borrowed truck into Ely with a portion of Josiah Hale's money and came back 3 days later with lumber stacked to the rails of the truck bed. Crates of window glass packed carefully in straw, kegs of nails, tins of white and green paint, rolls of tar paper and coils of copper wire, and the townspeople of Deadwater, who had watched her arrival months before with the mild, patient amusement reserved for people not generally expected to last the season, began instead to watch her unload that truck with something closer to genuine respect. She caulked the hull seams plank by careful plank with oakum and hot tar, exactly the way her father had once shown her to seal a boiler joint against pressure. She stripped and rewired the old oil lamp fixtures throughout 3 decks to run instead off a second-hand generator, testing every splice twice before trusting it with current. She rebuilt the sagging porch rail along the full length of the promenade deck board by board, testing each new joint's give with the flat of her palm the way her father had taught her to test any fitting before trusting it with a load. An old carpenter named Jebediah Cross came around during her second week of framing new stateroom walls, arms crossed over a chest gone thin with age, and watched her set a mortise and tenon joint for a full 5 silent minutes before finally grunting, "Where'd a girl learn to cut a joint like that?" "My father," Clara said, without looking up from her chisel. "He was a machinist, not a carpenter, but he always said a good joint's a good joint, whatever it's made of." Jeb only grunted again, unconvinced, and before he left he set her a small, deliberate test, a warped length of pine and a plane, and a challenge, half a dare, to true it flat and square by supper. She stayed at it 2 hours past supper, palms blistering, until the board lay flat enough to satisfy her own exacting eye, and left it leaning against the gangplank rail where he'd be sure to find it come morning. Jeb said nothing more to her that particular day, only turned and walked back up the gangplank the way he'd come, but he returned the next morning with his own worn tool bag over his shoulder and the trued board tucked under one arm. And by the end of the month he was teaching her the finer, more stubborn points of proper joinery in exchange for nothing at all but the plain pleasure of having someone worth the trouble of teaching. A quiet, broad-shouldered woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the counter at the town's one small diner, began leaving a covered plate on the Follies gangplank most evenings without a single word of announcement, and when Clara finally caught her at it one dusk and tried to thank her properly, Ruth only shrugged one shoulder and said, "Can't work a full day on nothing but beans, girl," and kept right on coming anyway, plate after plate, week after week, long after any excuse of pity could reasonably have explained it. And Tom Whitlock, the town's blacksmith and its only mechanic besides, wandered down one hot afternoon when Clara had the old boiler linkages laid out across a canvas tarp for cleaning. Crouched beside her without so much as asking permission, picked up a governor valve, and turned it over in his rough hands exactly the way her father used to. Squinting at the wear pattern the way a man reads a familiar page. "Whoever taught you to strip a valve like this," he said slowly, "knew his business better than most men I've met." "He did," Clara said. And something passed quietly between them in that moment that neither of them felt any particular need to explain further. Within the week he was down in the boiler bay most every afternoon, helping her convert the old firebox into a proper automobile repair bay, the two of them speaking the same wordless, practical language her father had first taught her on a Sunday afternoon workbench a decade before. None of it, Clara understood clearly even then, was friendship in any conventional sense of the word. Jeb, Ruth, and Tom were none of them people given to embracing her, or asking after the state of her heart, or sitting with her past the point where the work was done. It was something else entirely, something she came, in time, to value every bit as much, a community built, one plank and one valve at a time, out of nothing more sentimental than honest, shared work. Months turned into a year almost before Clara noticed the turning of them. The hull that had once been bare, scoured gray would now gleam a fresh white with careful green trim along every rail and window frame. The twin stacks stood straight and freshly repainted against the sky. The old dining saloon had become a proper lodging house with 8 clean, whitewashed rooms and real linens on every bed. And the boiler room below rang with the steady, confident clatter of an automobile repair shop that never once lacked for customers off the new highway. Clara renamed her the same week she opened officially for business, in careful gold leaf lettering painted fresh along the bow with her own steady hand. Hale's Landing, half a quiet tribute to the man whose long-hoarded money had made it all possible, half a small private joke about a ship that would never sail an inch again but had, at long last, well and truly landed. The town, without any particular ceremony, began calling her Captain Bishop, a title she came to wear the way she wore her father's compass, lightly, but never once without real meaning behind it. Her first notable guests arrived within that opening month, a traveling notions salesman named Otis Greer, who declared her mattress the finest he'd slept on the whole stretch between Reno and Salt Lake City and said as much to every drummer he met for 100 miles after. A weary family of 6 up from Oklahoma, dust-worn and road-tired past speaking, who stayed 3 quiet nights and left owing nothing at all, because Clara wouldn't hear a word of charging them. And who sent her a postcard from California 6 months later simply reading, "We made it. Thank you, Captain." And a young surveyor off the highway crew who limped in with a cracked front axle and left 2 days later having talked poor Tom Whitlock's ear half off about grade calculations the entire time his car sat patiently in the bay, where the old boat had once listed silent and gray in a dead riverbed, visible for miles as a monument to failure. She now caught the desert sun each morning in a blaze of white and green that travelers on the new highway had taken to slowing down just to look at. Some of them turning off the road entirely on nothing more than curiosity, which was, more often than not, exactly how Hale's Landing gained the better part of its custom. A full day at Hale's Landing, by the time its second year had properly begun, ran with the easy, unhurried rhythm of a place that had finally, fully found its purpose. Clara rose well before sunrise most mornings to stoke the stove and start the coffee before the light was even fully up. Ruth arrived not long after with a basket of warm bread balanced on one hip, grumbling good-naturedly about the heat before the day had even begun to earn the complaint. Jeb spent his slow mornings out on the porch mending whatever chair or shutter the previous week's guests had managed to loosen, humming some tuneless private melody to himself the whole while. And by mid-morning, most days, Tom's forge and Clara's own tools were both ringing away together down in the boiler bay, fixing whatever the long, hard highway had broken loose that particular week. Children from the handful of surviving Deadwater families had taken, over that first year, to playing tag along the length of the promenade deck most evenings after supper. And more than once Clara found herself crouched down beside one of them at the porch rail, showing a pair of small, dirty hands how to hold a screwdriver properly against a stripped screw. Or letting a curious boy peer through her father's old compass and asking him, exactly the way Elias had once asked her, to guess which direction was north before she let him check the needle for himself. In the evenings, once the last supper plates had been cleared and the last engine had gone quiet in the bay below, Deadwater's remaining families had taken to gathering on the promenade deck with the easy familiarity of people who no longer needed an occasion to see one another, trading news and gossip in the cooling air while the sun went down red and enormous over the empty riverbed, and Clara had come, without ever quite deciding to think of those evenings as the truest measure of what she had built, not the fresh paint, not the ledger she now kept for a thriving business rather than a dying one, but simply the sound of a town, however small, still choosing each night to be a town. Hale's Landing had become, without any single dramatic turning point she could ever quite point back to, the beating economic and social heart of a town the map itself had otherwise long since given up for dead. On a quiet evening some 3 years after she'd first stepped off that bus with one suitcase to her name, Clara sat alone in the old captain's cabin, Josiah Hale's cabin once. Her own private office now. The same iron-strapped door standing open on oiled hinges that no longer groaned, with the day's account books finally closed and a lamp burning low and steady against the coming dark outside the porthole. On the desk in front of her sat two small objects, side by side, exactly as they so often did on evenings like this one, her father's brass compass. Its case worn smooth beneath 4 scratched words that had guided her clean across a continent and into a life she could never have predicted, and Josiah Hale's small gold locket, holding 2 quiet faces she had never known in life but would never let herself forget in hers. One, she thought, was a guide pointing steadily toward whatever life still lay ahead of her, the other was a reminder of a life someone else had loved fiercely enough to guard, entirely alone. For 11 hard years, asking nothing in return but that someone, someday, might finally understand. She had long since given the little gold locket a permanent place beside the compass rather than tucking it away in a drawer, because it seemed to her, on quiet nights like this one, that the two of them were telling something like the same story from opposite ends, one about a man who knew exactly where he stood and walked forward anyway. The other about a man who could not walk forward at all, and so simply stood still and loved what remained until his last dollar and his last breath ran out together. She kept his photograph of Sarah and Ruth polished, and once a year, on the date his final logbook entry had trailed off into silence, she set fresh wildflowers on the desk beside it. A small private ritual that Ruth alone knew about and never once mentioned to another soul in town. She thought sometimes, on quiet evenings exactly like this one, of her Uncle Walton Cobb, sitting still, she imagined, behind that same tidy desk in Kansas City, and found, a little to her own genuine surprise, that she carried no real bitterness toward him at all anymore, only a kind of distant, almost tender pity. Because a man who measured the entire width of the world in careful ledger columns could never, not in 100 years of trying, have imagined that the niece he'd once priced at exactly $85 and closed out of his books would go on to build a life so wide and so warm that no column he owned could ever have been ruled wide enough to hold it. She did not write to him, and she did not need to. The not writing was, in its own quiet way, a kind of peace she had made and kept. She was 20 years old when she stepped off that bus in the middle of nowhere with a single battered suitcase and $73 left to her name, and she often thought, in these quiet hours in Josiah Hale's old cabin with the compass and the locket catching the lamplight side by side on the desk before her, that it was the best $73 she ever spent in her whole life. It had bought her far more, in the end, than a ruined boat sitting in a dead riverbed in a town the world had forgotten. It had bought her a home, a purpose, a town that called her captain. A family stitched together out of shared work rather than blood. It had bought her, in the truest and simplest sense of the word, a life entirely her own.